Sir Philip Green, at least for the time being, is in deep doo-doo, following my erstwhile parliamentary colleague, now Lord Peter Haynes' use of parliamentary privilege to break a decision taken by the courts to reveal nothing about the identity of a person referred to in relation to sexual harassment allegations and even racism. We first have to make absolutely clear that Sir Philip Green absolutely denies the allegations made against him. And he said in this statement, which I must refer to, "I'm not commenting on anything that's happened in court or was said in Parliament today. To the extent that it is suggested that I have been guilty of unlawful sexual or racist behaviour, I categorically and wholly deny these allegations. Arcadia," that's his company, "and I take accusations and grievances from employees very seriously, and in the event that one is realised, it is thoroughly investigated. In the event that one is raised, it is thoroughly investigated. Arcadia employs more than 20,000 people, and in common with many large businesses, sometimes receives formal complaints from employees. In some cases, these are settled with the agreement of all parties and their legal advisors. These settlements are confidential, so I cannot comment further on them." That's a robust and wholehearted denial of the allegations made. But it raises a number of important points before I turn to my thoughts on Sir Philip Green himself. It raises the issue of non-disclosure agreements and the access to the justice system of extraordinarily rich people employing £500 an hour lawyers who are able to conceal the identity of people who would not be able to be concealed if they didn't have the £500 an hour for the lawyer and didn't have the exorbitant court fees. It raises that issue, that if John Doe, who worked, say, in British home stores, were similarly accused, you'd know about it. You wouldn't know any more about the truth of the allegations, any more than you can know about allegations against Sir Philip Green. But you'd certainly know the identity of the person against whom these allegations were being levelled. It raises further the issue of parliamentary privilege and the right, an ancient right, of parliamentarians of whatever colour, stripe or character to make accusations against people without fear of any legal implications or repercussions for themselves. In the interests of full disclosure, I must say that I have myself used the laws of parliamentary privilege many times. I did so during the miners' strike, and I did so on many other occasions, both in written motions before the House and on my feet as a speaker in the House of Commons, a speaker to whom some people sometimes paid attention. And I make no apology for that. And I give you a pretty good example about another mogul now deceased. I was the Member of Parliament who revealed about the late Robert Maxwell many truths that would never otherwise have been revealed. That's because Robert Maxwell regularly used his vast wealth to make sure that uncomfortable allegations against him could never find the light, could never find the airwaves. One night, on a Saturday night, Seymour Hersh, the world's greatest journalist, had put through my letterbox, literally, a series of chapters from a book he was writing, but which could not be published in Britain. Could not be published because Robert Maxwell had injuncted the publishers, had injuncted all book distributors, had injuncted all book sellers. If it were not for my tabling some of the most succulent of the allegations made by Hirsch against Robert Maxwell in the House of Commons under parliamentary privilege, you might not know today that Robert Maxwell had stolen hundreds of millions of pounds of his own employees' pensions. You would not know that Robert Maxwell had employed as his foreign editor a man, I'm not making this up, involved in gun running. You would not know, if it were not for my actions under parliamentary privilege, that Robert Maxwell may well have revealed the whereabouts of the great, brave, Jewish Israeli citizen Mordechai Vanunu, who had come to England to disclose the existence of hundreds of Israeli nuclear weapons and their whereabouts. It was alleged by Hirsch that Maxwell, partly out of pique, that Vanunu told his story in the Sunday Times, then edited by my friend Andrew Neil, had disclosed Vanunu's whereabouts and thus caused his kidnapping and what subsequently happened to him, which is a subject for another night. But I did all of that under parliamentary privilege. And there was no other way that these allegations could have been spoken in Britain than my raising them under parliamentary privilege. Maxwell went large. He was a large man. He owned a lot of newspapers. He put me on the front page of all of them, defaming me in a spectacular way. And I'm still enjoying the fruits of those defamations, because a few weeks later, Robert Maxwell fell off the back of his yacht and drowned in the Mediterranean. And within days, every one of the allegations made by Hirsch and repeated by me in Parliament had been vindicated. My part in the downfall of one tax-dodging bully who never got a knighthood. So extreme were his behaviours. Sir Philip Green has been a target of mine for many, many years. Decades, in fact. It started when I discovered that all those stores that we thought had been owned by Sir Philip Green were not actually owned by him at all. It was Mrs. Green that was the business genius behind the rise and rise on the country's high street of Sir Philip Green. He was just the water carrier. She was the owner of the company. She was the business genius behind the rise and rise of Arcadia, Topshop, Topman, British Home Stores, and much else. I say she was the genius because, well, she must have been, because she was the registered owner of the company. Unfortunately for the British taxpayer, she lived in Monaco, on a yacht, on 2 yachts in Monaco, which unfortunately meant that none of the tax otherwise payable if the company had been owned by Sir Philip Green rather than Mrs. Green, or Lady Green, I suppose I should call her, needed to be paid, because in Monaco there is no taxation at all, least of all for the wives of billionaires who live on yachts. And then, on this very show, I was privileged to be able to fillet the deal, £1, the £1 deal, by which Sir Philip Green sold British Home Stores, a national institution, to a vagabond, to a man who could only have afforded to buy it at £1 and who subsequently ran the business into the ground, leaving, yet again, employees in their thousands robbed of their pensions. Sir Philip Green is no knight of the realm, in my view. He ought to have been stripped of that title over the BHS scandal, if nothing else. Now, I have absolutely no knowledge of the allegations made by some former employees against Philip Green. And I absolutely accept the presumption of innocence of any person accused of wrongdoing. But I wholeheartedly support Peter Hain's revelation in Parliament yesterday, because it's in the interests, not just of justice, it's in the interests of the British public that rich people cannot conceal themselves from view in a way that poor people could not. And for those reasons, I take my hat off to Lord Peter Hain. Now, the man who knighted Sir Philip Green was Tony Blair. Don't you just miss those Blair years when Tony could hand out the wool sack to his flatmates and knighthoods to any buccaneer that caught his fancy? And he's back in the news too, because thanks to the Daily Telegraph, we know that Tony Blair is being paid £9 million a year by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia for advice, don't you know, on the modernization of the kingdom. Well, we now know more than we did last Friday at this time about how that modernization project in the kingdom is going, how they are benefiting from Tony Blair's £9 million a year advice. We now know what we didn't last Friday, that everything that Saudi Arabia had said about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the US resident and Washington Post columnist, had been a lie. We now know that when they said that he had left the consulate peacefully and in one piece, half an hour after entering it, that was a lie. The second Saudi story, that Khashoggi had died as a result of a fist fight with 18 men of military age, one of them armed with a bone saw, was also a lie. We know that the third Saudi story, that there had been no look-alike, no body double involved, was also a lie. Saudi Arabia now accepts that a man who looked enough like Khashoggi had indeed donned the clothes, not just the suit, but the shirt and the vest of Khashoggi, and gone walkabout on CCTV in the hope of convincing the gullible that Khashoggi had indeed left the consulate in one piece. We now know and even the training shoes, that's right, the vest, the underwear, the shoes weren't right, but everything else was. We then know that the next Saudi story, this is all in 1 week, by the way, the next Saudi story, that it was rogue elements without any kind of meditation, premeditation, had carried this out, was also a lie. Saudi Arabia now accepts that the killing of Khashoggi was premeditated murder. The important thing to know now is who premeditated it. Well, we can't know yet for certain, but we do know that 5 of the 18 men were part of the Crown Prince's inner circle. We know that thanks to groundbreaking journalism, full marks to them, by the New York Times and by the Washington Post, which has tracked and recovered the photographs of these 5 men standing next to the Crown Prince on his various foreign perambulations. So if it was premeditated, and 5 of the people in the crew were in the Crown Prince's inner circle, and it is alleged, not yet actually on the table, but alleged by authoritative sources in Turkey, that telephone calls and other Skype calls were happening between the office of the Crown Prince and the consulate whilst the murder was taking place. You've got to say the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia's cloak is on a shaky nail. So much so that even Donald Trump is having to abandon ship. So we'll be looking in the course of this as to what all this means for Saudi Arabia and its closest allies, amongst whom, of course, are our own country. We'll be looking also at the breaking story out of the United States about the arrest of the alleged suspect bomber, who turns out to be an American white man, apparently right man, from Florida. We'll be talking to Michael Graham, our colleague and U.S. political commentator, about that. And we'll be talking about fireworks. It's going to be fireworks all night, actually, here on the mother of all talk shows. Happy birthday, Bill Wyman! Although, if I was his age, I'd no longer be celebrating my birthday. Do you know that Bill Wyman, that we looked at for all those years, on stage with the Rolling Stones, is 82 years old this week. It's unbelievable. Unbelievable. He left the Stones in 1993. Well, Rolling Stone gathers no moss. He, unfortunately, has. Barry, normally in Enfield, says George, loving the show, listening tonight from Los Boliches in the Costa del Sol. Have a great time, Barry. And think for yourself, says, remember Cameron gave Philip Green a job in government in 2010. Expenditure czar. Enough said. What do you think Tony Blair first saw in Philip Green that made him want to have him ennobled? Answers on a postcard, please. Fra says no sanctions on Saudi Arabia. Too much money to be made by the West. And the convergence of regional interests, Syria, Lebanon, Iran and Russia, is the glue holding this coalition axis together. Still bombing Yemen with American, UK coordination. Now, how's this for UK-American coordination? My talk radio colleague Michael Graham is on the line from the United States. He's also a columnist on the Boston Herald, don't you know? That's something to be. Because I wanted to talk to Michael on what's happening in the arrest of the suspected nail bomber, pipe bomber, who may have blown up the American midterm elections. And he's on the line now. Michael, welcome.
Excellent word choice there, George. And the only thing he's blown up are the elections. So the latest word we have, and the story's ever changing, so I reserve the right to amend my remarks. But apparently none of the devices that this Looney Tunes sent were actually actionable. They had no ability to be detonated. And
unlike the devices dropped by many of the recipients of the bombs.
You can certainly make that case, and we can talk about Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama's foreign policy if you like. But I don't think that this, based on what we know about this guy, who apparently has had fantasies of being a professional wrestler who worked for a while as a male stripper, who has been repeatedly arrested since the early 90s. And one of the charges upon which he's been arrested is threat making and the like. He's apparently a guy who, as we would say in the States, he's a fry short of a Happy Meal, or not the sharpest knife in the drawer, or whatever phrase you want to use.
He was on parole. He is on parole for other offences, and yet he was driving around in a van festooned with pictures of the likes of Hillary Clinton with a target, a crosshair, pointing at our face. You'd think the probation officer might have noticed that.
And it's interesting because his social media of late seems to indicate a lot of political content and, go get the Democrats and support my President Trump, et cetera. But the people who've known him say he's never been particularly political, that he was very much obsessed with this kind of dream he had of being a professional wrestler, and that he had a difficult time just getting along with people, which is why he was always in front of the magistrate. So we'll see. But based on what we know about the guy right now, he's not political in the way that ideologues are political. He wasn't a Bill Ayers bomb maker or a Timothy McVeigh anti-government guy who could point to the writings of Edmund Burke. He's apparently just kind of a nut.
Now, it does destroy the Trumpian attempt, though, to paint it all as a false flag, as something being done to him rather than being done by someone who supports him.
Yeah, I agree with you. And one of the reasons why the right in America is split is because there are a bunch of traditional small government conservatives, people with whom you would have a great deal of a disagreement on politics, who are not prepared to follow Trump and the Trump supporters down these sorts of rabbit holes like false flags and conspiracies and the like. They're just not prepared to do it, and it's an embarrassment, they feel, to them and to the ideas that made them Republicans or conservatives to have this kind of lunacy. I mean, I guess, we've always had lunacy, and maybe it's because I've been spoiled. Most of the craziest craziness in my adult political life has been from our friends on the left over here in the U.S., but those days are over. We are at least at parity if the right hasn't passed them by a leg or two.
Now, what do you think the impact, Michael, will be on the midterms of all of this?
It's a really good question. A bunch of smart people that I know have completely different theories. Some think that the Republicans were already, they needed a perfect, in pool, I think you guys call it billiards, whatever, but you needed the perfect bank shot. It's kind of, you had to bank 3 times for the Republicans to hold the House. It's just very unlikely. There's a 1 in 3, 1 in 4, 1 in 5 chance. Mm-hmm. And anything that throws off the groove that the Republicans had since the Democrats mishandled the Brett Kavanaugh judicial fight is bad news. So that's one theory. Is that it was going as good as it was going to get. It still was a long shot. It's now not. It's now longer. On the other side, there are people who say anything that whips up the partisan fever that just has Republicans versus Democrats helps Trump, because the Republicans he needs are the ones who are not what we call in the political world over here high propensity voters. That is, they're the ones who vote maybe every presidential year. Maybe Trump, one thing that people don't talk about with Trump is, like President Obama before him, he got a bunch of non-traditional voters to show up. That's why his wins in places like Ohio and Michigan were missed, was because these people showed up who just don't normally vote. And so the thinking is anything that whips up the kind of Trump versus the world fight may pull some of those low motivation voters to the polls for the Republicans. So the answer, George, is I have no stinking clue. That is my final answer.
It's an honest answer. I saw him tonight. He looked a little bit less sure of himself than he normally does. I mean, he must realize that, having gone out on a limb implying that it had all been a false flag, he realizes that this is at least possibly disastrous for him.
Possibly disastrous, or it's also the case that he's good at fighting if he can figure out who to fight and what their vulnerable spot is. Well, who do you fight on this? The fact is, you could argue that one of the signs of the problem in American politics is how everyone reacted to this. Think about the story, George. Let's pull everything aside. Trump anti-everything is pulled aside. What really happened? Some loony guy sent a bunch of fake bomb-looking devices to famous people because he's a loony. That's all that happened. Take Trump and Clinton all stuff out of it, and this is just some nut, and he goes to jail. We don't think about it. It's the surrounding cauldron of political bubble and toil and trouble that is, that's now setting off and reacting to. And Trump can't figure out, okay, who's across from me on this? Because there really isn't anybody. How do I go after him? Well, you really don't. And so I think that's one reason why he seems off-footed, although he will be rallying later today, our time, here in the U.S., and I'll be covering it on CBS, and so we'll see if it gives me something to talk about.
Is he likely to recover his confidence on that tonight? I mean, I was amazed that he gave house room to the false flag type response.
Right.
He should have just said, we've got the best police, the best intelligence, and all the usual, and we're going to get to the bottom of this. He could have stayed above it, out of it.
Yeah, but that's not Trump, and that's not how he got to be Trump, and so that's the problem. I don't know that he'll recover tonight, but I will. I can't take a second to explain why people on the right are so reluctant to engage in this conversation about why don't we just turn down the rhetoric. I happen to be the token Republican on a panel the day after that Bernie Sanders guy shot up the Republican baseball team about 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And I was invited on the show, and I assumed, because it was public radio, it was very to the left, that it was going to kind of be a, you Republicans, we've got to do something. You're right. We've got to tone it down. Anti-Trumpism has gotten out of hand. And instead, the conversation, I'm not making this up, George, violence against Republicans. Why don't Republicans turn down the rhetoric? What? Wait. That's backwards. And that's the way that this conversation is here in the States. And I think that you see some of this in British politics, particularly around Brexit, too. It's kind of a heads I win, tails you lose thing. If a person who's connected to the right acts violently, why don't you people on the right straighten up? If a person on the left attacks the right, why don't you people on the right straighten up and stop making people attack you? And so that's one reason Trump, I don't think he feels like he can wade in with something magnanimous, because he and his voters just don't trust the media broadly or the Democrats across the aisle to be in any way fair in return.
Lastly, Michael, and I'm grateful for your time, many people feel that the barely concealed violence of much of Trump's rhetoric is a dangerous thing, that it's a kind of Mussolini type thing, and that he says the words and other people do the actions. Do you see, I know you're a Republican, you're not a Trumpist. Do you see any merit in those allegations?
Generally speaking, no. The reminder, like you give everybody, we'll be talking about on my show, 10 p.m. Saturday night, is America's been very blessed with a low amount of political violence. We just don't have a lot of it. Out of 320 million people, we're very fortunate. But at the same time, there is a small yes, because for the first time in my adult lifetime, we've been seeing street fights, groups of pro-Trump people and anti-Trump people on the street. It hasn't happened a lot, but the Antifa folks on the one side and these kind of loose gang of, they call themselves Proud Boys on the other. And it's very small, but there should be none of it. And no doubt about it, President Trump's rhetoric helps create, along with all the other anti-Trump rhetoric and the, oh my God, he's a fascist rhetoric, helps create that environment. I talked to a professor today and wrote about it from Rutgers, who said what's interesting to him is that the divide on the left is people who fear that Trump may have some fascist tendencies and they complain, versus the people who honestly believe he is a fascist dictator right now, and that's why anything they do, including violence, is legitimized. And for the moment, those people are the clear minority on the left, but every day that Trump opens the door to violence, he's opening it on both sides.
I'm sure you're going to talk about this on your show tomorrow night, Michael. Remind us, 10 p.m. on Talk Radio.
10 p.m. to 1 a.m. right here on Talk Radio. 3 hours from the right side of the pond, and I mean the right in every sense of the word. because, of course, George, unlike you, I'm always right.
Michael Graham, thanks for joining us. Michael Graham of Talk Radio and the Boston Herald. Not many people can say that. Now, let me just do some more of the written material. It's coming in fast. Lizzie says, glad Tamar was on. It gave me a chance to catch up on some reading. From John White 1. I have no idea why they don't like you, Tamar. And Leave It says, note Putin is staying tight-lipped. Maybe he wholeheartedly approves after the Skripals. And Bob Justice says, I noticed Tamar has had to change tack on the Saudi regime as the weeks have progressed. He's done a bit of a Trump. He needs to talk to Doogie from Eastern Beirut to get informed. Not sure about this backstabbing of May either. She's still a sitting tenant. That's true, Bob, that last part. She is still a sitting tenant. Every one of these Tory rebellions, though seemingly solid, melts into air. And Fergal Leddy says, hi George, on the news about Paul Flynn MP's stand down. You have anything to say about him? I do indeed. Paul Flynn was a friend of mine for many decades, actually, and I'm sorry that his declining health has forced him to create a by-election apparently soon. Unless a general election comes up, he wants to save the taxpayer money. Paul was one of a distinguished group of octogenarians sitting in Parliament, a group I once hoped to join myself. But Dennis Skinner is, I think, the last of the octogenarians when Paul goes. But he used to make the point, and I agree with it, and I agreed with it long before I was in sniffing distance of his age, that it's not good to have a Parliament only of young people whose historical memory is necessarily limited and further limited by the class composition of the Parliament, by the education cohort from the best universities from which most of them come. I was talking about this in the week, I forget where, but I was making the point that when I entered Parliament 31 years ago, I was one of hundreds of MPs that had never been to university, that had left school and gone into the world of work. There were hundreds of us. But by the time I left Parliament, almost 30 years later, I was one of a very, very select few. Now, Paul Flynn was a man with courage and eloquence. He stood up on the issue of the Iraq War, for example, foursquare with me and Corbyn and Mr. Benn and others, and he was proved to be right. But he also had the courage to take issues on which I disagree with him, but which he prosecuted with clarity and courage. Amongst them, his campaign for the legalization of cannabis. I'm not myself persuaded of that, but Paul was, and indeed on the terrace of the House of Commons, he poured liquid cannabis, who knew there was such a thing, into the tea of a man who required it for medical purposes. So I'm very sorry that he's going, Fergal, and I wish him, notwithstanding the severe health problems that he has, a very long and peaceful retirement. And Christina says, pointless for Saudi to kill a journalist to prevent criticism because the public find out the truth via the internet. Indeed, Christina, and they find it out eventually here on the mother of all talk shows too. The first hour is by, the second hour beckons. Stay tuned for the mother of all talk shows. Now, I mentioned earlier about how all that was solid in the Conservative Party when it comes to rebellion usually melts into air. That's exactly what seems to have happened this week. I predicted here last Friday that Theresa May could be out by the time of this show, as indeed she could have been. I predicted that an interim premiership of David Davis might be agreed between the warring parties seeking to succeed Theresa May. But that hasn't happened either. She did face the 1922 committee, which is a very sombre sounding name for the backbench Tory MPs sitting in concert. And she got the traditional roll of thunder that you can hear all the way across the corridors as they all beat their public school hands on the desks in front of them. It is a very schoolboy kind of thing. It doesn't always mean that the person being received with such approbation is necessarily going to survive. And more than 50 Conservative MPs have now publicly pledged that they will vote against Theresa May's Brexit position, even supposing the European Union were to agree to it, causing the very real possibility, maybe probability, of absolute checkmate, logjam in the House of Commons when the Brexit deal finally comes by. But are there 48 signatories of the Tory MPs to bring forth a motion of no confidence, which would undoubtedly, I think, lead as a prelude to the demotion, the defenestration of yet another Tory leader? And I've lived through quite a lot of them because I was a child prodigy. I remember the overthrow of Harold Macmillan. I remember the defenestration of Edward Heath. I remember the defenestration of Margaret Thatcher very well indeed. I was in Parliament when it happened. I remember the ways in which the Conservative Party has, as one of the world's oldest political parties, the ability to act like a great white shark when it comes to the destruction of the leader they were just beating the desks for, metaphorically speaking, only a day or two ago. But that didn't happen this week. And so I started looking at the ranks of the Conservative Party. And I'll tell you what struck me. It struck me that the Tory MPs are increasingly like public schoolboys. And I don't mean that in a inverted class snobbery kind of way. I mean, it's all schoolboy japes. They're ready to tell any journalist that they have sent in their letter. They're thinking about sending in their letter. She won't last. Some of them even using lurid, violent metaphors, like she better bring her own rope to the 1922 committee. She's going to be, metaphorically speaking, stabbed and so on. A kind of violence that is quite unbecoming and intolerable, actually, after what happened to the late Joe Cox MP. But nothing ever actually happens. There are no ropes. There are no knives. And I got to thinking that that's what they were, in fact, behaving like. And so I've asked Sir Anthony Seldon, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham, a former headmaster at Wellington College, about the Tory classroom. And I'm going to put my thesis to him, that when you look at the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg, the likes of Boris Johnson, they actually are people who haven't grown up. They are exactly as they would have been in the tuck shop at the private school that they once went to. So we'll hear from Sir Anthony shortly. But before we do, it's quite right that we hear from John in Glasgow. Go ahead, John.
Hello, George.
Hi.
You are very fulsome in your praise of Lord Hayne, but I'm afraid I don't think I'm necessarily going to be quite so charitable to him.
Okay.
Because I think there's a big difference between your own case, which you mentioned, to do with people's
Maxwell.
pension.
Yeah.
Yes, people's pension funds and all the rest of it, and tittle-tattle about who touched who, when and where, which dominates and disproportionately dominates public discourse, both public discourse and political discourse currently. If Lord Hayne had waited until the whole legal process had got to its conclusion, perhaps, but to intervene, 24 hours after the Telegraph tried to float their story without the names, naming Philip Green, who I'm no fan of, by the way. But if he wants to name Philip Green, why doesn't he name the accusers too?
Well, it's a
Under
principle.
parliamentary privilege.
Well, because it's a principle of British law that people who are making accusations of sexual misconduct, impropriety, harassment, assault, don't get named. That's the law. You might argue that law should be looked at again, but that is the law. So he wouldn't do that. Look, I understand what you're saying, of course, but there are two issues here for me. The first is that Sir Philip's identity was only concealed because he could afford to spend potentially hundreds of thousands of pounds on legal processes to keep his name out of the papers, that you or I would not have been able to do, John. And that means there's a justice system for rich people and a justice system for the rest.
Well, the trouble is the rest never go to court because they don't have any funds that anybody wants to sue them for or get off them. And these accusers...
No, John, you and I could be falsely accused by someone this evening. But it would be in the papers before you could say Jack Robinson, because we would not have been able to afford to go for a court injunction to stop it being in the papers.
Well, that's right. But these accusers here, I suspect, have probably already been fulsomely paid off. Again, you could say that's only something that Philip Green can do and his ilk.
Well,
and
suspect is the key word there.
Non-disclosure agreements, and now they want to have another bite of the cherry. So why should they then, under this cloak of anonymity, which you correctly say is currently law, they want to take the money? They want to sign the non-disclosure.
We don't know any of that, John.
No.
We don't know that any of these people have taken money. We don't
Sounds
know.
like it.
We don't know it. So it's your suspicion, and it's out there. You've said it, but it's my duty to make the point that none of us know the truth of these allegations, and it's also important to reiterate that Philip Green absolutely wholly denies them and may well be entirely innocent of them. My point is, if I was falsely accused or you were falsely accused, it'd already be in the papers because we can't afford to go to the court. But here's my second point. There's no way that you can be a little bit pregnant and you can't have a little bit of parliamentary privilege. Parliamentary privilege has to be an absolute, and it has to be able to be used by people for high purposes, as I think I did on many occasions, and also what you might think low purposes. You can't say that you can have parliamentary privilege on this, but not on that. You either have it as part of our unwritten constitution or you don't. I'm sure you can agree with me on that.
Well, that's right. However, I do suspect that Lord Hayne has perhaps wanted to re-emerge from the oblivion or obscurity of the House of Lords, which is what it is in this particular case, and has preempted.
Well, I'm no fan of Peter Hayne. He was the Minister for the Middle East. He was the Minister for the Iraq War. I once was, when he was a left-winger, quite close to him, but like so many that took the shilling, took the soup, as we say in Ireland, and went over to the Blair project, he became a very different man. So I would not praise him for anything, but I defend his right to use privilege in the way that he did for the reasons I've said.
Indeed. However, this law that's currently in place, you're quite right. I do think they need to look at that. We've had all this stuff, Operation Midland and Nick, and people come out with all sorts of accusations, left, right and centre, are able to somehow hide behind the cloak of their own anonymity. Other people's reputations are ruined. And I'm no fan of Philip Green. I mean, he's done the same as what BMW did with Rover. These people who appoint captains of ghost ships and send them off to sink. Yeah. So he's not certainly nobody's hero.
He should. Well, I think he should have got his knighthood taken off him for that.
Well, that's correct. The only saving grace is that he did actually stump up 300 odd million at the end of the day.
He did, but not that he did stump that up, but that was just a proportion of the loss to the pensioners. My last question, John. What if the allegations, some of them, all of them, one of them, are true? Don't we deserve to know in a free society what people are accusing other people of?
Well, yes and no. It then comes back to this thing: if these other parties, you get these people coming forward with accusations, etc. You don't see as many people coming forward with accusations against the common man, where there's nothing to gain. It's a lot of it's the compensation culture, and if they want to take the shilling from people like Weinstein or Green and sign non-disclosure agreements, in some respects, they have already been compensated and they were quite content to take money. And that is an aspect which is not right either.
Okay, John, thanks very much for that contentious set of points of view on both sides there. 0344 499 1000. Where do you stand on these matters, on Peter Hain, on Philip Green, on the legal process, on the parliamentary process that has unfolded? 0344 499 1000. John, another John, says, George, we all know that Tai Fu famously put the T in Britain. Other T's are available. Is it not high time to substitute the letter N with the letter D in Green, as in the surname of Sir Philip Green? That would make it Sir Philip Greed. Well, he's a vastly wealthy billionaire. I've no idea if that's what Tony Blair first saw in him. Scouser Lar says somebody should do a YouTube video of all the contributions from Tamar, because it will make a fantastic cure for insomnia. That's a bit harsh, Scouser Lar. Now, I've got Sir Anthony Seldon, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham, former headmaster at Wellington College. If I'm not wrong, a former biographer, or a biographer, of Tony Blair. I'm sure I was on a panel with him, or on a debate with him, on that very subject, but I may be wrong. In the break, we'll check it, because I want to test my thesis that the Tory MPs are nothing but a bunch of public school boys. The wonderful Grace Slick, to my astonishment, is celebrating her 79th birthday. The front singer for Jefferson Airplane. Now that takes me back. As does my next guest, Sir Anthony Seldon, a knight of education, a man who knows all about schools, public and private. He's the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham, former headmaster at Wellington College, and he's very generously agreed to come on the show for no pay to talk about my thesis that the Conservative Party in Parliament are behaving like schoolboys, some girls, mainly boys. Sir Anthony, thank you for joining me.
Absolute pleasure, George.
Thank you. What do you think of my thesis? Don't you think it's all a bit juvenile?
Yeah, I think that it's not giving a good example, is it, to the nation and to young people in schools when you see politicians behaving so badly. But the thing, George, that really I think is very wrong is the language that was used about the Prime Minister, which was inciting people to really the violent behaviour.
Violent metaphors. It was quite shocking, actually.
They were shocking, and I would absolutely insist that those people who said that language to the journalist are named and shamed, because I think only if we do that will people stop talking about Parliament. I mean, Parliament, for goodness sake, as we try and teach people in school, is the apex of democracy, and where you talk about the Prime Minister entering a killing zone and people putting a knife into her and heating it up, this is the kind of language that demeans democracy, and I think is not going to do anything to encourage themselves to resolve their own disputes in civilized ways. So I think that's really bad, actually.
And then they didn't do anything anyway. After all that violent, aggressive talk, which is as if the Joe Cox murder had never happened. After that, these vile metaphors, actually, when she came into the room, they gave her the traditional drum roll on the desks, and she's lived to survive to fight another day.
Absolutely, and I think partly because there was a revulsion against the language that was used, and it played to her benefit. But look, nothing in my lifetime, anyone's lifetime, has been like Brexit. There are very good people on both sides of this argument. It's divided the country, divided families, divided communities, straight down the middle. And what we need to do is to talk about it in civilized ways without falling back on murderous language. And after this is all over and we're going to be leaving Europe, for better or worse, we do have to get on with each other.
Can you imagine how divisive it would be to have a second go at this?
Yeah, I mean, though I was in favour of Remain, I don't think a second referendum is going to be the way forward. We had the first referendum. My side lost. That is now it. It was close, but we lost. And that's what happens. And I think another one now would be very dangerous and also impossible to organise in any time frame. So I think we just have to go ahead with this. And if after 10 or so years it shows that the benefits haven't transpired, there can be another benefit, another referendum. But I can't see that happening for 10 or more years.
Now, Sir Anthony, we've both been present at the defenestration of leaders. We've seen the overthrow of Mrs. Thatcher. I even remember the overthrow of Harold Macmillan. That's how old I am. We've seen how Tony Blair was eventually forced out of office after a long campaign by his next-door neighbour. How do you rate the campaign to get rid of Theresa May as compared to those other examples?
Well, really interesting question again. Interesting that Macmillan was forced out in part because his Europe policy had failed, and Thatcher because of the unpopularity of her European policy. This has gone on for 50 and 60 years, this division over should we be in or out of Europe. As far as Theresa May goes, I think that she probably has less support now, but that people cannot see a clear alternative. So if they could, they would probably go for that person. Not, and this is where I'm in a very small minority, not because I think she's particularly bad, but because it's simply, I think in many ways, I think history will judge her in a very different way and far more positively. It's simply almost impossible to be Prime Minister at this time in 2018 with the country so divided and so little idea about where to go. So I think probably deeper, but the lack of an agreed alternative is really significant in keeping her there.
Well, this brings me back finally, and I'm grateful for your time, to my schoolboy metaphor earlier. I mean, when I look at someone like Boris Johnson, he's like, to me, an overgrown public schoolboy. I could imagine him throwing bread rolls across the halls at the teacher, behind the teacher's back, and so on. Jacob Rees-Mogg looks to me like a scarcely grown public schoolboy. Yet these are both potential candidates for the premiership. Do you think that's likely, possible?
I don't think that Boris Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg will be a candidate because, you can say that about their behaviour, and indeed certainly with Boris Johnson, his behaviour has often been reminiscent of that of a school boy, and certainly, if not that, a university undergraduate. And maybe in some ways he's never grown up beyond that. But I think that the next leader of the Conservative Party will be somebody not on one extreme or the other, either extreme Brexit or extreme Remain, but it will be somebody who is in the middle, because that's the way the Tory party throughout history has been so successful at keeping on to power. It always goes after a bust-up for somebody who's a healing candidate in the middle. So that's what I think will happen. But, this is such a funny time. Everything I ever thought was likely to happen in politics has been overturned, and who knows?
Well, Sir Anthony, I'm grateful for your attempt to run the runes of this whole affair, and thanks for joining us on a Friday night here on Talk Radio. That's Sir Anthony Selden, Vice-Chancellor, no less, of the University of Buckingham, former headmaster at Wellington College. So let me know what you think. Theresa May, in or out? Is she going or is she staying? Is the problem, as Sir Anthony thinks, that there's no clear alternative, so they're hanging on to nurse for fear of something worse? I myself think that she looks and sounds like a beaten premier, one that would even possibly welcome a break from the toils of the premiership at this very, very difficult and divisive time. Still talking about Philip Green, talking about Khashoggi and the Saudis and the trail that leads back, sorry to say it, leads back overwhelmingly likely to the royal court itself. Will Carpenter makes a very funny and good point. Sir Green and Lord Hayne, are we not blessed with such fine and upstanding individuals within our nobility? And he puts speech marks around the word nobility, and rightly so, Will. It is a remarkable thing. We talk about the United States, often disparagingly, often with a sneer, and yet they have a system. They have a constitution. They have a Bill of Rights. They have a powerful Supreme Court to ensure its implementation. What do we have? I mean, let's take Sir Green. How do you get made a Sir? Which I've no doubt opens all kinds of doors in life. How do you get made a Sir? Well, we know from Lord Cashpoint that there's actually a tariff, that if you donate X amount, you can be put forward for a K. But if you donate X plus Y, you may be in line for a P. A peerage, that is. What is a peerage? Well, first of all, you get called a lord. A lord. For the rest of your life. Your wife gets called a lady. Lady, capital L, for the rest of her life. Your children get called honourable for the rest of their lives. All of them. All your children. All your legitimate children, that is. They get the honorific, capital H, honourable, in front of their names. But more than any of that, you get to sit in the country's parliament, passing laws, stopping laws, passing budgets, stopping budgets, declaring war, stopping war, and nobody ever elected you. In the case of Peter Hayne, of course, he was many times elected as a member of the House of Commons, but he was made Lord Hayne on the whim of a Prime Minister of the day. Would be Gordon Brown, I guess. Now, that's just wrong. However you look at it, it's wrong that you can be made a knight of the realm, capital K, because you donated money to a political party, or you could be made a lord. I mentioned him. I quite like him, actually. One of the few that I like, Charlie Faulkner. Lord Faulkner was made a lord because he was the flatmate of Tony Blair. And not just a lord, but a minister, but a cabinet minister. He was made the Lord Chancellor, no less, sitting on the woolsack. And his credentials, his qualifications were that he used to pick up the dirty socks of Tony Blair strewn around the flat they shared and put them in the laundry. That has to be wrong. And now we have Sir Green being unmasked by Lord Hayne under an unwritten parliamentary convention called parliamentary privilege. As Will Carpenter says, are we not blessed with such fine and upstanding individuals within our nobility? Patrick Vidine says, who is this joker? Sir Anthony Kidding. House of Commons, apex of democracy, my derriere. In my view, the whole lot should be sacked, and the undemocratic political system that we have, that perpetuates the slavery of ordinary people, consigned to the bin. I'm with you on much of that, Patrick. X-Ray Vision says the problem with society is that if somebody's wealthy, it's automatically assumed that they're a good person. Is it really? This is not necessarily so, he says in a masterpiece of understatement. Hashtag Philip Green. And think for yourself, says Tommy Robinson, is the common man who was again smeared by Bercow and MacDonald in Parliament. Hashtag parliamentary privilege. If it wasn't for donations, TR wouldn't be able to sue these liars, and he will. Time the establishment and its cronies were in the dock. Now let me deconstruct that for you, Mr. Genius, Aeneas. First of all, if it was said under parliamentary privilege, it can't be sued. That's the whole point of parliamentary privilege. Secondly, Tommy's had a lot of donations. So much so that he's just bought a £950,000 house in a gated community. So if you're one of those that have donated, enjoy. Maybe you can look through the gates at how Tommy, the common man, is now living. Tommy Robinson is no working class hero. As my good friend and the finest writer in Britain today, John White, says in a wonderful piece he's just written and put up on the internet, he's not a working class hero. He's a ruling class hero. He's a mascot, a tool, a stooge for his betters. Fra says the Tories won't force a general election with Corbyn a PM in waiting, and they won't force her to resign during these shambolic EU negotiations, as a change of leader will necessitate a change of direction in the negotiations, taking us back to square one. And Paul Booker says, Jess Phillips says that her 2015, quote, I won't knife you in the back, I will knife you in the front, unquote, comment to Corbyn just meant she wouldn't talk about him behind his back, but would always say so to his face. What do you make of this, George? Backtracking? I think the least I say about Jess Phillips, the better. Let me have your calls. 0344 499 1000. 0344 499 1000. Give me a call. Won't cost you more than a penny or two. Maybe a couple more of these. Scouser Lar. As much as I agree with Peter Hain using parliamentary privilege, it is time to abolish the House of Lords. Long past time, my friend Scouser Lar. The Communicipalist says Tory MPs threatening to eliminate each other is one of the reasons I voted Leave in the first place, George. David Cameron blinked, and we in austerity England's hinterlands outdrew him. Brexit is a grassroots mutiny against austerity, a slave revolt. You know, Mr. Communicipalist, I couldn't have put that better myself. Is that what Bill Wyman's doing now? He should have stayed in the Stones, actually, or retired with the rather large financial settlement. But he's 82, still going strong, still performing. 0344 499 1000. Now, you wait weeks for a night to come along, and then two come along at the same time. We've just had Sir Anthony Seldon. Now we've got Sir Kerry Cooper. Professor Sir Kerry Cooper, director and founder of Robertson Cooper, 50th anniversary Professor of Organisational Psychology and Health at Manchester University. And because we believe in balance and fairness and impartiality, we better hear from Sir Kerry because he's a strong opponent of my point of view on Brexit, and surprisingly, Sir Anthony Seldon, who was a Remainer, is a Remainer, but thinks another referendum in Britain would be, schizophrenia, Professor. National schizophrenia would break out. The divisions in the society would only deepen, and they're already deep enough. What do you say to that particular objection to the people's vote?
Well, let me tell you, George, the way I think about it. I think it's the absolute opposite of that. And the reason I say that is this. We're divided now. The country is divided, right? We voted, in June 2016, we had the vote. We voted, we looked at a black box, and it was a concept. Nothing was in the box. We didn't know what it would mean, the implications of it. Over 2 years, we have more information, but not a hell of a lot, but we have more information about the possible complications of it. But for me, the most important thing, and the reason why I want a people's vote on the terms, and incidentally, I don't want a three-way vote. I'm worried about that. I just want to vote, do we accept that we're leaving, whether it's hard or soft? That's one side, and the other side is we stay in. And now, why I want it...
So you want a people's vote on which Remain is one of the options?
Only one of two. Because
Okay.
it gets really complicated, George. But
because otherwise it's a multi-option referendum, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, if indeed there is a third potential option, because we don't even know if there's going to be one, I suspect there is going to be one. I suspect the EU and the UK will come to terms, and there will be some compromise, a custom union for a period of years. Who knows what that option is going to be? Okay, but let's say it's checkers or something like that. Then I personally wouldn't like that. I would like to just say, look, whether it's checkers or hard, that's one side of the argument, or we stay in. But the important point I think I'm trying to make is this. I believe that actually to resolve the differences within our country, the most important way of resolving it is because each side says, the Leavers say, we voted, that's the voice of the people, okay? The other side say, not really. Now that we know more about it, a lot of Leavers don't want to leave. Now, they're both taking these positions. If we have a people's vote on it, I, as a Remainer, if ultimately the vote goes for let's leave, whether it's, let's leave on whatever the compromise is or even a hard Brexit. If they say we want to leave, as a Remainer, I now accept it because everybody knows what's in the box or knows more about the box than it did in June 2016. So I want to resolve our differences within the country, and the only way to do that, to stop Leavers saying this is the people's will, and to stop the Remainers saying, but we now have more information, and that's not what people want. So
Well, look,
the only way to resolve it
the
is
traditional
to have
way,
this final vote.
Professor, the traditional way in Britain of resolving matters is a general election. That is the people's vote, isn't it? You
Yes,
have
it
a
is.
party which says, if you elect us to power, we'll do X or Y in relation to many things, including the European Union.
I
Now,
agree.
we had a general election just 1 year ago, and it was after 2016. It was 2017. And the
Absolutely.
parties that ran on a platform to accept the referendum result got more than 80% of the vote. So how is that not a people's vote?
Okay, let me tell you what I feel about that, George. I actually think that if we had, say we had a general election, that's another option that, obviously the Labour Party want a general election rather than a people's vote. Or no, not the Labour Party. Let's just say the senior members of the Labour Party, the leadership of the Labour Party. But both of them are leaving. Both want leave. The Conservatives want leave, and the Labour leadership want leave. Not the Labour Party, incidentally, because the bulk of the Labour politicians, if they had a free vote, and you know this, don't you?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it would be, 70% of them?
More.
Maybe 80
More,
would
yeah.
want to remain.
But 2/3 of them are sitting in pro-leave seats.
Yes, they're doing that. But if you ask them what their opinion is for the good of the country, forget their post, forget the fact that they're looking after their own career. Forget that. If you were to ask them, are you remain or are you leave, you'd probably find 75% of Labour politicians, of Labour MPs, are for remain. But you are right, they're in constituents which are leave at the moment. So it resolves that problem if we have a vote, because if the vote then goes, I'm sorry, we've changed our mind, and now we want to remain, then they are safe because they actually want to remain, but they're worried about their job. So that solves that problem.
Well,
I just think the solution to the national division that we have, and it is a division, is let's test the water. Are they right? Are the Leavers right that this is the will of the people? Or are the Remainers right that they have changed their mind because they now know what's in the box?
You see, if I was on the far right, if I was the leader of the EDL or the Football Lads Alliance or Britain First or even UKIP, not quite as far right, but pretty out there. If I was them, leading them, I would earnestly pray that your point of view prevails, because nothing could further a narrative of a stab in the back by the establishment, by the elite, by the knights of the realm, by the captains of industry, by the gurus of the city, and so on. It would be a godsend to the right. They would say, we voted, you cheated, and therefore democracy means nothing. You'll keep going until you get the result you want.
I wouldn't ask for another referendum. And the only reason I'm asking for a people's vote, which I feel passionately about, is to resolve the differences within the country, number one. And number two, because now we know we voted for a principle in 2016. We had no information. People didn't think through the logic of what this was going to mean for us.
Did you say that at the time, Professor?
Sorry?
Did you say that at the time? Or did you think, as most of the establishment thought, that you were going to win?
To be honest with you, George, I actually didn't know. I mean, I voted Remain, but I didn't think through all of the logic of it. In other words, the complicated nature of it. I thought that we were going to be punished for voting that way, punished by the EU. Rightly so, because I'm a psychologist, right? And if you're in a group, you're in a club, and you don't follow the rules of that club, then you get punished. You're breaking the norms of that club. That's basic social psychology. So I knew that the EU would punish us in one form or another.
Yeah.
Or
I'm not actually breaking the rules, to be fair.
they are going.
We're not really breaking
the
the rules, Professor. We're just saying we don't want to be in this club anymore. Why should you be punished for that?
Yeah, but it's not just about punishing us because we don't want to be in the club. They obviously they don't want to lose any more members. But all right, they will resolve this. By the way, George, they will come up in the next few weeks with a solution. It'll be the worst of all possible solutions because we'll probably still be in, but not have any say. That's why I want to vote on in or out based on all the facts that we now know more about what the implications are if we leave.
Well, finally, and I'm grateful for your time, and it's with some trepidation that as somebody that left school at 16 and went to work in a factory, I challenge you, a professor of psychology, on a matter of logic. But forgive me for doing so.
No, do it.
The logic is of what you've been saying, that you have another referendum between hard Brexit and soft Brexit. There is no logic that allows you to return to the substantive point, the point of principle that we're leaving in the first place. Do you see my point?
Not really, no.
Okay, well, my point is we've already resolved to leave the EU. On the basis of your argument, there is an issue about whether we leave it on these terms or that terms. But to go back to a decision that was made just 2 years ago.
Their minds.
Well, but you can say that about, you can say that
know,
about anything.
George, after the last 2.25 years, they've had so much information, not, by the way, just from the EU.
Yeah, but I say that every time the Tories get in.
Gloom merchants, but think about it.
Professor, I say that after every general election.
Information from all sorts of bodies saying what the implications are going to be. With that information, they didn't have that kind of information before. What they had was...
Professor, I say that after every general election. If only we'd known this. They concealed that. They lied about this. They exaggerated that. They traduced us on this. That would be a recipe for annual general elections.
Yeah, but, we probably shouldn't have gone down the line of a referendum because the country isn't designed that way. Our democracy in the UK isn't designed. I come from California, George. In California, by the way, the referendum is statutory. It's a part of the process. If you get 5 or 8%, I can't remember what it is, of signatures to put something on the ballot, it automatically goes on. And you can, the next year, do the opposite. And you have, and it's statutory and it counts. So in California, the referendum is part and parcel of the democracy. Here it is not. Therefore, we don't have kind of rules about it.
I think it's here to stay. To be honest,
think it is. I think you're right, and probably
we've only got a minute. Can I ask you on that because I didn't know you were from California?
Yeah, I'm from California.
Might there be a referendum on California seceding from the Union?
I don't think it will.
No? Okay. It's a pleasure talking to you always, Professor Sir Kerry Cooper of Manchester University, putting robustly his point of view. And I hope you didn't think that I was too robust in rebutting his point of view. But I want yours now. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. Julie Morrigan says, Owen Smith's campaign manager Lisa Nandy, and no doubt others, are considering voting for Chequers. It may go through. It may indeed, but it won't be Brexit. Tom Jarvis says, it's a shame Mrs. Merton is no longer with us to ask Tony Blair what first attracted him to the multi-billionaire Philip Green. Tom, I wish I'd said that. The second hour is almost over, but the third hour beckons. 0344 499 1000. I'm not sure what that was apropos, but it's not a bad tune. Here's Marty in Belfast. Go ahead, Marty.
Hello, George. How are you?
I'm well, by the grace of God. What would you like to talk about?
George, it was very interesting listening to the head teacher there, Anthony Seldon.
Yes.
Yeah, well, whether you agree with him or not, I thought he was refreshingly honest.
Yes, definitely.
And, I know he wrote a book about Blair and all of that, but we're not going into that. But the language aspect, the whole how people conduct themselves in public forum and so on, I agree, that the violent discourse and the metaphors, totally inappropriate. I'm not a Theresa May fan. But, given what happened to Joe Cox, for example, politicians have to be tempered in their language.
Exactly.
Now,
especially, we know from this guy in Florida, and we know from the Joe Cox case here, that when some people say things that trigger violent actions by others, those who say the things that triggered it have got to be more careful, at least in the future.
Of course, and the other thing is, George, that this language used by our political leaders, it seeps in then into the public, the public generally, and whether they're talking politics or not, then people just feel that they can say whatever they want. And witness, for example, that old racist knuckle dragger on the Ryanair flight this week. I mean, that was, if I had been sitting behind that woman and heard that guy doing what he was doing or saying what he was saying, I'd have dragged him off the plane myself.
Was it not actually as disturbing as what he said that no one else intervened to stop him saying it?
Unbelievable.
Apparently somebody did from behind. I'm wrong on that. I've just been corrected.
Yeah, but the other thing is, George, and here's something that truly gets me, and it's 2 points I'd like to make briefly. Firstly, the media. The hypocrisy of the media as well has to be called out because, look, yes, what was said about Theresa May was disgraceful, but what is always and almost day and daily said, let's not beat about the bush here, about Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, the guy has suffered an almost daily diet of lies, smears, character assassination, including violent imagery, violent punditry. The guy you have on sometimes, Dan Hodges, had I remember the double page spread in the Daily Mail, killed Jezza. And there's Corbyn lying in a coffin like a dead vampire. That is unbelievable. Not a peep, by the way, by any media commentator, any other politician, particularly the right-wing Labour hypocrites who are out now dancing all over this issue.
Well, a very, very powerful series of points there, Marty. I'm grateful to you. Because of the hour, I need to push on. If you want to join in on that subject, on any of the subjects we've been talking about this evening, 0344 499 1000. Tom Jarvis says, no, I've done that one. It was a very good one, Tom. I kept it on my screen. I liked it so much. John says, all animals, wildlife, are very anxious with heightened senses, which may cause death. Please check for hedgehogs in bonfires. And Simon Bartle says, fireworks have already started going off here. Absolutely hate the things. Not a soldier myself, but I was deliberately burned by one, by my own father, no less. Suffice to say, I don't have any time for them. My goodness, there lies a tale, Simon. Think for yourself says, no, of course Tommy Robinson won't be able to sue Bercow and MacDonald unless they stepped out from behind their privilege. They won't, of course. Donations will allow him to sue others. You're wrong about his £900,000 house. You sound like an MSM headline reader. Pity. No, I was wrong if I said 900,000. It's 950,000. Bob Justice says, call me a conspiracist. I've not heard any of the language aimed at May attributed to any particular person. Most strange. Also, I know Boris Bunter is full of bluster and Lord Charles Mogg mea culpas, but they now appear as weak as May. What's happened? That's a very powerful point, Bob, more pithily put than I did it myself. It's what I was trying to say. For all their violent language, the two of them have turned out to be powder puffs. Melanie Baines says, did you know that the Tory whips made sure the 1922 committee meeting was stuffed full of Theresa May supporting MPs? There wasn't any room for those who wanted to vote her down. Trust me, Melanie, if you want in to a meeting in the House of Commons, there's plenty of space that you can force yourself into. James is on the line from Oxford. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, James.
Hi, yes. I mean, I voted in favour of Brexit, basically because I'm against austerity. I wanted, I want a socialist Europe. I don't want a capitalist one. That's really introduces and brings about all the austerity. We have things like all this flexible working, zero contracts and things like that. And that only really helps the bosses. You know, you see over in Greece what they've done with Greece when they wouldn't play ball with Greece, what they're doing in Italy, what they've done in Spain, and
Portugal.
Demonstration.
And Portugal.
And Portugal.
They told the
France,
Portuguese people they couldn't have the government they just elected.
Exactly. And in France, the massive general strikes and things like that, opposing changes to labour laws and things like that. And,
that wasn't the EU, of course. That was President Macron, the Tony Blair of French politics.
I know, but I mean, they all support the EU.
Yeah, the prevailing neoliberal orthodoxy, that's true.
Yeah. And one of the other things I would say is, as well, supposing it had been on the other foot, the people who wanted to remain just got it by 1%, And it seems to me that they just want to vote until they get the right outcome.
But what do you think of, what do you say to the professor's point of view, is that people voted for a concept, they had no detail, and that now that they have more detail, they ought to be able to have a second go. What do you make of that argument?
I think on both sides, people voted either way for 1,000,001 reasons. There can't be. You could, as you just pointed out, you could keep saying, well, it's like, Theresa May only just got in, so let's have another election.
Okay, James, I need to press on. But good call. Don't be a stranger. Come back again. That's James in Oxford. Fra says MPs are nominally meant to represent their constituency via their electoral mandate. If the people vote leave and the MPs vote remain, they must be deselected now. Well, up to a point, Fra. If for example, my constituents, unlikely, of course, as it was in Glasgow at the time, if my constituents had been in favour of the Iraq war, does that mean as their MP I had to vote for the Iraq war? Of course, wild horses couldn't force me to do that. I wouldn't have done that. I think if you're going to have a parliament of delegates, that's one thing, but we don't have that. When I said to the professor earlier about annual general elections, I had to check myself because the Chartists, of course, were in favour of annual elections. That was one of their, I think, 5 demands. They thought that the only way to keep our democracy honest was to have annual elections, so that if a member of parliament was seriously askew from their constituents' point of view, you wouldn't have to wait 5 years before you could get rid of them. Hell's Bells says MPs are not there to decide what's best for us. They're there to represent what the public decides. Well, the same caveat that I just made to Fra, up to a point, Lord Copper, as they used to say in Private Eye, up to a point. I agree. I supported Zach Goldsmith's private members bill and was proud to do so. I was one of the proposers of it, to have the right of recall for members. And this was attempted in the north of Ireland just recently in the case of Ian Paisley Jr., where a given number, a proportion of the electorate, if they sign a petition demanding the recall of their MP, then that must happen. And I supported that, and I agree with that, which might go some way to meeting your point, Hell's Bells. And this is from Mark. George, Sir Professor, the man is an undemocratic elite, out-of-touch, bubble-living fool. Brexit is coming. Sincerely, Mark, Bournemouth Brexit Battalion. We are Legion, he adds. Simon says, Brexit is a total catastrophe. It's caused nationwide division and political turmoil. Since we voted, we have had scaremongering, vague speculation, no clarity, and no clear leadership. I personally wish the whole thing had never happened. And Sean Caden says, what utter poppycock from the professor. He talks about the box. I'll tell you what the box is. It's Pandora's box. And what's inside it, believe me, Britain does not want to see. I totally agree, Gigi. A people's vote would be gold for the far right. Tommy could get another house out of it. Marie McFarlane says, the professor is being disingenuous. Had 6 Leave campaigns, not been censored by the MSM, then I say more would have voted Leave in 2016. This info wasn't known. Far-right Blairites and Tories put hundreds of millions into Remain and are still doing so now. And Mark Adkins says Tommy Robinson is no rebel or working-class hero. He's a chancer who will do or say anything for money and fame. He is more Boris Johnson than John Lennon. He is the puppet of rich men who want the working class misdirected from the real enemy. Well, if you've got a different point of view on that, call me 0344 499 1000. Maybe even Tommy, Stephen, Yaxley, Lennon, Robinson is out there. Maybe he's got a phone with him. 0344 499 1000. Here's the legend that is Lizzie Fletcher in Gloucester. Lizzie, welcome back.
Hi, George. How are you?
I'm good. I'm missing our friend Tony. I hope he's not away on some adventure.
Well, I'd imagine he is definitely away on an adventure.
He's ever thus.
Yes, he's an adventurous soul.
He is. Tell me.
I wanted to talk to you about Khashoggi. We're hearing that his character was a reason for his demise. I mean, obviously there can be no justification for the way of his demise, but is there any validity in the suggestions?
I don't quite know what you mean by character.
Well, the way that he was a mouthpiece for interests that were financially supported by people that we shouldn't be listening to, if you get what I'm
it's a bit like Donald Trump's statement that the murder of Khashoggi was done poorly. I mean, how should you murder a journalist?
Exactly.
That isn't poorly. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. The point is the man was murdered. He was murdered in a consulate in somebody else's country by nationals of the country whose consulate it was, in what is now accepted universally was a premeditated plot to murder him. And so there can be nothing but absolute blanket condemnation of that. And he was an opponent of sorts of the Saudi Arabian government, which was his right in any normal society. It's not in Saudi Arabia. You're not allowed to be an opponent of your government. But for people on the left or people who are Democrats who believe in liberty, the right to be against your government is surely absolute. He wasn't a dissident per se. He supported the Saudi government on many things, but he had begun to oppose them on some key things, and in particular on the war in Yemen. He's one of those Saudis who, realizing the scale of the disaster in Yemen, had begun to turn against it. And he had the goods on the rulers in Riyadh, because he had been a part of their circle, and therefore he was a clear and present danger to them.
Exactly. And Blair was over there. Was he hired to spin the story?
Well, I like to think that if he was hired to spin the story would have been spun a bit better than it has been. One thing you've got to say about Tony Blair, he knew how to spin a story. So I suspect he isn't involved in spinning this story because it's being done so catastrophically badly. I mean, for example, who on earth would have advised them, let's get the son of the guy we've just killed and bring him in for a handshake in front of all the cameras? In fact, that was a further, if you'll forgive the pun, a further nail in the coffin of the credibility of the Saudi regime, don't you think?
Yes, exactly. And you're right that if Blair had, I mean, how many people did he fool?
Well, he was good enough to win 3 elections. and some say he fooled people in that.
Yeah.
He certainly fooled the Labour Party for long enough that he was a Labour man. Lizzie, thanks for the call. Melanie says another thing, George Galloway. I'm sick and tired of hearing people like the professor you have had on tonight telling me that I didn't know what I was voting for when I voted to leave the EU. I did know. I wasn't taken in. I wasn't lied to. He has really made my blood boil. And Marie, my old pal, Marie McFarlane says, the professor's being disingenuous. Oh no, I've done that one. Forgive me. Christina says, I get the impression Theresa May will survive until after Brexit. And although there may be a new leader of the Tory party, we'll be stuck with a Tory government until 2022. What does George Galloway think? Will Labour coup MPs help Theresa May survive? Yes to all of the above, Christina. Looks that way. Chris says, it is people like your professor guest who are causing division in our society. We voted to leave, so why isn't that being respected? Also, robust conversation isn't offensive. Surely that's what shows like yours are all about and thrive on. And Sean says the Magna Carta attempted to be nicked in Britain in 2018. Is this irony of the highest order? If it wasn't so serious, it would be hilarious. Sums up the current UK perfectly. And this is an SMS. Evening, George. Professor Cooper stated that if there were a second referendum on the terms of Brexit, he would accept it. With respect to the professor, it isn't for him to accept or not accept the decision. He lost the vote. Soft Brexit is not a Brexit at all, and Leave voters are increasingly aware that this is just another means of undermining their democracy in favour of de facto continuing EU membership. I guarantee that the presumption of entitlement to dictate what is and is not acceptable by comfortable academics and establishment figures will stick in the craw of millions of Leave voters who, contrary to the insulting assertions, knew what they were voting for. I, for one, will not accept any attempt to betray our vote. That's from Samson in Kilmarnock. Powerful, as always, from Samson. Let me put my own cards on the table on this. If we remain in the customs union of the European Union, we are effectively remaining in the single market. And if, by so doing, we must continue to allow free movement of labour, if we must, by extension, continue to accept the authority of European Union courts and law, then we might as well stay in the European Union. Actually, it's worse than being in the European Union because at least we get to send Claude Moraes, who was on the show last week. We get to send him to the European Parliament. We at least get to send, I appreciate this is a diminishing return, Jeremy Hunt to go and sit in the ministerial councils. At least we have a voice. At least we have some MEPs there. At least we can elect whom we choose to speak for us there. But if we become, as what Mrs. May is going for, seems to me to be, rule takers from the EU, whilst losing any influence amongst the rule makers, that's actually a fate worse than having remained in the EU in the first place. Tell me what you think about that. By the way, Tamar, is Jeremy Kyle actually the king of controversial conversation? Surely. I mean, how many kings can you have? Am I not in the running to be the king of controversial conversation? Is the great James Whale not in that league? What about Mike Graham and the Independent Republic? What about the surreally brilliant Ian Lee, who's coming up right after me here on Talk Radio? No disrespect to Jeremy Kyle. I love him and he shows wonderful radio. But there's a few kings of controversial conversation around here. Just saying. Chris in Colchester is up next. Go ahead, Chris.
Hiya. All
Hi.
right. Could I just make one point and then talk about Brexit? You said earlier about Philip Green that you believe in innocence till proven guilty, but then you said about the suspect in the pipe bombing thing that now we've got this guy we know it wasn't a false flag, but he is a suspect, isn't he? It's not.
I think I called him a suspect, but in any case, he's in a different jurisdiction. I'm obliged in this jurisdiction to obey the laws here.
Yeah. I'm just saying
I'm not so bound in the United States. No, of course. I think I called him a suspect right from the start.
Yeah, no, it's just that you said that it kind of rules out the false flag sort of thing, but it doesn't really, because he's still a suspect. And given that the FBI worked with British spy to try and stop Trump being elected and all the subversion throughout history, I wouldn't rule anything out anymore. Nothing surprises me now. But of course, I've also said that it could just be some loony Trump fan. That's also a possibility. But so, I just remain open-minded about it.
Or a Trump fan who isn't a loony. Not every Trump fan is a loony, of course.
No, I know. But regarding Brexit, I just think we're not going to leave, and we never were allowed to leave. If our were serious about Brexit, I mean, David Cameron ran off crying, but then we replaced him with another Remainer. And then, I could have told her from the beginning we weren't going to get a deal from the EU. So the course should have surely been like, basically, we're going to have to leave without a deal, but we will leave aside that you might give us a free trade deal at the last moment. And for Theresa May to call that election last year, it was just absurd, and I don't know why she did it. And
I don't know how history can absolve her from that. Sir Anthony was saying he thought that Theresa May would be viewed more kindly by history, but it's hard to see how that could be true because she's the one who threw away the majority she already had.
And it was one of the worst manifestos. I mean, it was like,
worst manifestos, worst campaigns.
It was kicking the core voters in the face, but like, we're going to steal all your money, like old middle class people. And it was like, well, let's kill a few foxes in the meantime. It just didn't make sense to me. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if he kind of, almost wanted to lose maybe a few seats and get rid of Corbyn in the process, which could have.
That is a conspiracy theory too far, Chris.
I know it is, but
no, I think it's. We mustn't make the mistake of imagining that our rulers are James Bonds. They really are Austin Powers.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It could have been a complete blunder, but it just didn't make sense to me at the time. And she's I think she should be held accountable for what she's done.
Well, I'll tell you what I said on day one, and it's still available on YouTube, on the morning, early morning, dawn of the day after the referendum. I said that she should form a committee which she jointly chaired with Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition, and she should trigger Article 50 on the first day, and any negotiation or discussion that the EU wanted to have with us should have been had with Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn. It was the determination to keep the opposition away from these negotiations, and then the pitiful performance of our negotiators that has put us in this parlous place. Now, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I've kind of said that from the beginning. Because it's such a major issue, I think our politicians need to grow the hell up and be adults.
Yeah, it was the biggest thing since the Second World War for us.
Exactly. It's such a serious issue, and I just wish they'd grow up. Labour are calling for election because they want to sort of get back into power, but this is more important than political parties. This should be a cross-party.
I think it's too late for that now, Chris. But anyway, thanks very much for your call. Very interesting one. Darren Thompson says, George, even I didn't know that Vince Cable was on Strictly. Shame his dance partner wasn't Anne Widdecombe. That would have been well worth watching. Fantastic show again, George. Sets me up for the weekend. Thanks for that, Darren. I was on a quiz show, it's not gone out yet, with Anne Widdecombe the other day. Anne Widdecombe, what's her name? Edwina Currie, Lembit Opic. It was for charity. My charity was the St. Vincent de Paul in Glasgow. Hers was a goat sanctuary in her former constituency. Mal, no, I've just lost Mal. Joe says, I'm sickened that people's vote types are worrying Brexit will affect Strictly Come Dancing, while many Brexit voters are worried about where their next meal is coming from because of austerity. We knew what we voted for, Professor. Hashtag Lexit. I must say, it has taken a turn for the surreal that the leader of the Liberal Democrats prays in aid of the People's Vote campaign that we may be left short of foreign dancers for Strictly Come Dancing. Vince, that strictly takes the biscuit. And Mal, here I've got him back. George, for goodness sake, the reason we're in a mess with Brexit is because Remainers have tied our government's hands and done the EU's work for them. Now, with 4 months or so left, they all want another vote on a probably bad deal without even an idea of what another referendum would even ask. They can't even get by a should it be 2 choices or 3. No matter what, we know the Remainers, will only vote to stay in the EU, with a deal or without. All the Remainers have done is given everyone a never-ending headache. A point I didn't make to the Professor because I made it earlier, or rather a caller made it earlier. No, Sir Anthony Selsdon made it earlier, is that actually there's no time to have another referendum. We are out of the EU at the end of March, although I suspect, as I've said, it will be Brexit in name only. The Communicipalist says what we have more information about now than when we voted in the referendum is the degree the EU will go to punish us for the crime of exercising our historic democratic rights. The worst outcome of the people's vote will be increased civil discord. And Fra says, I have unlimited empathy for conscripted soldiers forced to go to war. I have no sympathy for those who voluntarily join state forces like America and Britain, which appear to be involved in continual immoral imperialist conflicts. Stop the wars now. And Paul Booker says, I'd be interested in how much the UK government make in tax from fireworks each year. An FOI request was made in December 2015, but the HMRC could not determine the amount of VAT collected from their sale. I'm prepared to bet it's in the millions, though. And David Leviscont says, I have a bit of deja vu, George. I remember Ireland's referendum. Just keep having referendums until you get the result they want. Sad days for so-called democracy. And Marie says, as far as I'm concerned, what's happening with Brexit is just the same as happened in Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy and Ireland. Not accepting the people's vote of 2016. British Remainers want a rich people's vote. Democracy in peril. Yes, the people's vote in 2016 and the people's vote in 2017. Both Labour and the Conservatives ran on a manifesto accepting the referendum result. And they got more than 80% of the people's votes. My absolutely beautiful and brilliant wife has just walked into my studio. I hope I'm not in trouble of any kind. No, she's given me a lovely, beautiful, big smile. Well, it's been marvellous for me, and I hope it was for you. This song is for Mrs. Galloway. Next week, same time, the mother of all talk shows.